By the summer of 1935, New York had learned to live with fear. It came from gunfire, from explosions, from names whispered too carefully in back rooms. Few men embodied that fear more completely than Dutch Schultz. He ruled through spectacle. Public violence meant to travel faster than rumor, louder than reason. And for most of the city, it worked. Except in Harlem. Harlem operated differently. Not because it was weaker, but because it followed a different logic. Violence there didn't automatically translate into control. It only worked if the community accepted it. And there was one man who made sure it never did. Bumpy Johnson wasn't loud, he didn't posture, he didn't need to. Harlem didn't fear him in the way other neighborhoods feared gangsters. Harlem understood him. That difference mattered. When Dutch Schultz realized intimidation wasn't breaking Harlem's resistance, he made a fatal assumption that a public killing would do what pressure couldn't. One clean execution, carried out in front of witnesses, would collapse everything Bumpy had built. It was the kind of move that had ended wars before, the kind that usually worked. What Schultz didn't realize was that he wasn't facing a rival who needed to win by force. He was facing someone who understood consequence better than fear. Someone who knew that the most powerful response isn't always to strike harder, but to strike smarter. This story isn't about an assassination that failed. It's about why it failed in the most humiliating way possible. About how a plan designed to terrify Harlem instead forced the most violent mob boss in New York to retreat. And about the moment when the Mafia learned a rule it would never forget. There are places where violence stops being currency. Because what happened next didn't just save Bumpy Johnson's life, it ended a war without starting another one. It proved that mercy, when chosen by the right man, could be more frightening than bloodshed. And after that night, even the loudest gangsters learned to lower their voices in Harlem. In the early 1930s, Dutch Schultz had a reputation that preceded him into every room. He didn't negotiate when intimidation would do. He didn't wait when pressure could accelerate outcomes. His method was simple: make examples so public and so brutal that resistance collapsed before it formed. Across much of New York, that approach worked. Businesses paid, rivals relocated, entire blocks learned when to look away. Harlem was the exception. Not because it lacked violence and not because it was poor ground for profit. Harlem resisted Schultz for a more uncomfortable reason. Fear didn't unify the neighborhood the way it did elsewhere. It fragmented it. And fragmentation made control expensive. Every show of force required more men, more money, more attention. Schultz could win fights there, but he couldn't end the conflict. The difference was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy didn't challenge Schultz head-on. He didn't need to. He let Dutch spend. Let him send crews that came back injured, arrested, or quietly discouraged. He allowed pressure to meet friction at every step. Leases questioned, suppliers delayed, intermediaries second-guessing their exposure. Nothing dramatic, nothing headline-worthy. Just enough resistance to make progress costly and unreliable. That's the part Schultz misread. He assumed resistance meant defiance. In Harlem, resistance meant management. The neighborhood wasn't rejecting power. It was choosing which power made sense. Bumpy's authority didn't come from spectacle. It came from predictability. Disputes were resolved. Boundaries were consistent. If you followed the rules, business flowed. If you didn't, doors closed. For a man like Schultz, predictability without submission felt like an insult. As weeks turned into months, the imbalance became personal. Schultz wasn't losing money. He was losing momentum. And momentum was his currency. He understood how to end stalemates elsewhere. Escalate publicly, force a reaction, make the cost of refusal unbearable. Harlem, however, absorbed escalation without breaking. Each attempt to shock the system only clarified who actually controlled the outcome. That realization pushed Schultz toward a decision that felt inevitable to him and reckless to everyone else. If pressure wasn't enough, the response had to be visible. Loud, final. A moment that would travel faster than rumor and silence any debate about who set the terms. What Schultz failed to understand was that Harlem didn't answer to moments. It answered to consequences. And the moment he chose spectacle over strategy, he stopped playing the game Bumpy had been winning all along. By mid-1935, Dutch Schultz wasn't thinking about Harlem as a market anymore. He was thinking about it as a challenge to his reputation. That shift mattered. When power stops optimizing for results and starts optimizing for image, mistakes follow quickly. Schultz had built his name on visibility. When he wanted compliance, he didn't whisper, he demonstrated. Bodies in the open, businesses torched in daylight, messages that didn't require explanation. In most neighborhoods, that kind of violence shortened negotiations. People paid not because they agreed, but because they understood the cost of hesitation. Harlem didn't respond that way. Every escalation Schultz ordered there produced noise, but not submission. The community closed ranks, not out of loyalty to any single man, but out of self-preservation. Spectacle created witnesses. Witnesses created consequences. And consequences slowed everything Schultz tried to accelerate. What should have been intimidation became friction. That's when Schultz made the wrong calculation. Instead of asking why fear wasn't converting into control, he doubled down on fear itself. He decided the problem wasn't enough violence, it was the lack of a defining moment. One act so public, so unavoidable, that Harlem would have no choice but to concede. Not a warning, not pressure, a statement. The logic felt sound to him. Kill the symbol, and the structure collapses. And the man everyone quietly relied on, and the neighborhood would scramble to accommodate whoever remained. It was the same play Schultz had run before, and it had worked often enough to feel reliable. What he missed was the nature of the symbol he was targeting. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a figurehead propped up by fear alone. He was embedded. Removing him wouldn't simplify Harlem, it would destabilize it. And destabilization wasn't something Schultz could control from the outside. A public killing wouldn't end the problem. It would fracture it into pieces that resisted management. Schultz also underestimated something more subtle: restraint. He interpreted Bumpy's refusal to escalate as reluctance. He saw patience as delay. He assumed that if nothing dramatic had happened yet, nothing dramatic could happen. That assumption blinded him to the possibility that the response wouldn't mirror the attack. Spectacle invites mirrors. Strategy avoids them. By choosing a loud solution to a quiet problem, Schultz committed himself to an outcome he could no longer shape. Once the decision was made, the machinery of violence began moving forward, but the initiative had already slipped away. Because the moment power announces itself for attention, it stops listening. And in Harlem, not listening was the fastest way to lose control. Bumpy Johnson didn't learn about danger the way most men did. There was no tip delivered breathlessly, no warning shouted across a room. What reached him were inconsistencies. Small shifts in behavior that only mattered if you'd been watching the same patterns for years. Harlem talked. It always had. Not loudly, not directly, but in fragments. A familiar face avoiding eye contact. A delivery arriving late without explanation. A restaurant manager suddenly nervous about a night that was supposed to be routine. To outsiders, these were nothing. To Bumpy, they were signals converging. He didn't ask for confirmation right away. Confirmation locks you into reaction. Bumpy preferred anticipation. He let the information layer itself, testing whether the unease had direction or was just noise. It didn't take long to see that it pointed inward, not toward a rival crew moving openly, but toward something meant to happen in public, under normalcy, disguised as routine. That detail mattered most. Violence planned in shadows could be countered in shadows. Violence planned in plain sight required a different response. Bumpy understood that the setting was part of the weapon. A crowded room diluted accountability. Witnesses created paralysis. Panic turned precision into chaos. Whoever planned this wasn't trying to win a fight. They were trying to end an argument permanently. And that told Bumpy exactly who was behind it. Dutch Schultz favored statements over solutions. If something needed to be settled, he wanted the settlement to echo. The pattern fit. So did the timing. Schultz was running out of patience, and men who rely on fear tend to accelerate when it stops producing results. Bumpy didn't try to stop the plan immediately. Stopping it outright would have preserved Schultz's leverage. It would have confirmed that intimidation still worked. Instead, Bumpy focused on reshaping the outcome. If the attack was meant to display control, then the response had to demonstrate something stronger: choice. That required preparation, not interruption. He adjusted routine subtly, not enough to signal alarm, just enough to ensure visibility where it mattered and absence where it didn't. He positioned people without advertising it. He allowed the environment to remain calm because calm was the canvas the lesson needed. Most importantly, Bumpy made a decision before anyone else had fully committed to theirs. He chose how the night would end, not whether it would happen. That distinction is the difference between survival and authority. By the time the final pieces fell into place, the danger itself was no longer the threat. The threat had been absorbed, redirected, and stripped of its purpose. What remained was an opportunity, not to retaliate, but to redefine the balance in a way that couldn't be argued with later. The men who thought they were setting a trap never realized the trap had already been reset. And when the moment arrived, it would reveal something Dutch Schultz hadn't considered. That fear only works until someone decides not to use it. The room didn't feel dangerous. That was the point. On nights when violence is coming, most people expect tension to announce itself. Raised voices, sudden movements, an edge in the air. This night offered none of that. Music flowed, tables filled, conversations overlapped. Normalcy did its job, dulling instincts and flattening urgency. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen a place at ease with itself. Bumpy Johnson understood why it had been chosen. A public setting doesn't just provide cover, it distributes responsibility. Witnesses hesitate, bystanders freeze, noise delays comprehension. If the plan succeeded, the shock would travel faster than facts, and fear would do the rest. That was the logic behind spectacle, and it was exactly why Bumpy refused to interrupt it prematurely. He didn't arrive early. He didn't arrive late. He took his place as if nothing were different, because difference attracts attention. The people he trusted were positioned without clustering, visible enough to see, invisible enough not to be read as preparation. Calm wasn't an act. It was the condition that made everything else possible. When the disruption finally came, it didn't unfold the way the planner intended. Instead of confusion cascading outward, the moment collapsed inward. What should have scattered the room focused it. The sequence broke. The signal misfired. The crowd's attention locked onto the wrong center. And in that instant, control changed hands, not through force alone, but through timing. Bumpy didn't rush. He moved decisively, not dramatically. The difference mattered. Drama invites interpretation. Decisiveness closes it. Within moments, it was clear to everyone present that the outcome would not match the intention behind it. The attempt to terrify had failed to produce fear. What it produced instead was clarity. People understood two things at once. First, the attack had not removed authority from the room. Second, whoever planned it no longer controlled the ending. That realization is more disarming than panic. Panic scatters. Clarity settles. The noise ebbed quickly. Order returned without instruction. The environment reasserted itself as if correcting an error. And the correction carried a message that didn't need explanation. Across the street, in the place where calculations were being made from a distance, Dutch Schultz saw enough to understand that escalation had backfired. The very visibility meant to amplify fear had instead exposed a limitation. Violence could start events in Harlem, but it could not finish them on his terms. The night ended without triumph or celebration. There was no announcement, no victory lap. That absence was deliberate. Victories invite rematches. Lessons end them. By the time the room returned to its rhythm, the balance had already shifted. The attempt to dominate had been converted into evidence. Evidence that fear no longer set the tempo here. From that point forward, every option available to Schultz carried a cost he could not control. And that is when power changes hands. Not when someone falls, but when the person who ordered it realizes there is no next move that doesn't make things worse. What followed confused people who expected blood to settle everything. In most underworld conflicts, escalation is answered with escalation. A public attempt is met with a public response. Bodies fall, lines harden, and both sides commit to a future where backing down is no longer possible. That's what Dutch Schultz was prepared for. That's the war he understood how to fight. But that war never came. Instead, something far more unsettling took shape. Restraint. Not hesitation, not weakness, choice. Bumpy Johnson didn't turn the night into a massacre. He didn't authorize retaliation across neighborhoods. He didn't make Harlem bleed to prove a point. He allowed the damage to stop exactly where it did, no further, no louder. And in doing so, he changed the meaning of what had just happened. For men like Schultz, mercy was not comforting, it was destabilizing. Violence follows rules. You can map it, price it, respond to it. Mercy from a dangerous man does not. It creates uncertainty about the future. It suggests that the person across from you isn't acting out of impulse, rage, or fear, but out of calculation. That calculation is what ends wars, because it removes the illusion that the next move will restore balance. Schultz understood this quickly. If Bumpy had answered spectacle with spectacle, Harlem would have turned into a battleground. That would have justified further intervention, further pressure, further bloodshed. But by stopping where he did, Bumpy denied Schultz the one thing he needed to continue: legitimacy. There was no outrage to exploit, no chaos to ride, no excuse to send more men without admitting failure. The message was simple and terrifying in its clarity. I can end you if I choose. I just decided not to. This time. That is not forgiveness. That is dominance without noise. From that point on, any move Schultz made toward Harlem would look like obsession, not authority. Any escalation would expose insecurity. Any retreat, while humiliating, would at least preserve control elsewhere. The calculation became unavoidable. So Schultz chose the only option that didn't get worse with time. He stepped back, not because he was beaten in the traditional sense, but because he had seen enough to know that further conflict would only confirm what the night had already proven. That Harlem no longer responded to fear, and that the man who controlled its outcome did not need to kill to be obeyed. And once that realization set in, the war was already over. After that night, Harlem didn't change its tone. It didn't celebrate. It didn't boast. It simply continued. And that continuity was the clearest signal of all. For the first time, fear had failed to buy obedience, and everyone who mattered noticed. Dutch Schultz understood the implication immediately. He hadn't lost men because of weakness. He had lost leverage because his favorite weapon no longer converted into control. Spectacle had exposed him instead of intimidating others. And once that happens, every future threat sounds louder than it is effective. What Harlem learned was simpler and far more durable. Authority doesn't come from how much damage you can cause. It comes from whether the damage stops when you decide it should. Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that line with precision. He showed that violence could be contained, redirected, and ended without spiraling into chaos, and that the choice to spare could be more final than the choice to kill. That distinction ended the war. Not with a treaty, not with an announcement, with an understanding. Once it was clear that escalation would only worsen the outcome for anyone pushing it, there was nothing left to negotiate. Harlem didn't need protection through terror anymore. It had proof of control. Years later, people would mythologize the moment, focusing on shock, on blood, on the audacity of it all. But the real lesson lived underneath the noise. The lesson was that fear is a currency that devalues quickly. Use it too often, and people learn how to endure it. Remove it deliberately, and they learn who decides the rules. That's why this story still matters. Not because of what happened in one room on one night, but because of what didn't happen afterward. No endless retaliation, no prolonged chaos. Just a boundary everyone agreed not to cross again. In Harlem, power didn't need to shout after that. It had already been heard.